At 6:42 p.m., with the sun still bright on my quiet street, 2 police cars rolled in. Neighbors stepped outside, phones raised, whispers spreading faster than the sirens fading behind them. The HOA president stood smugly near the curb, arms crossed, certain this moment would finally break me. They had called the police to intimidate me, to make me fold, to remind me who supposedly held power. What none of them knew was that a clock had already started ticking, and 72 hours later, everything they believed about control would collapse. This story didn't begin with flashing lights. It began months earlier with a small notice taped to my door, accusing me of violating a rule so minor it felt insulting. I followed every instruction, submitted every form, and paid every fee. Each time, the goalposts moved. Fines multiplied, warnings escalated, and private emails turned into public shaming. The HOA thrived on pressure, and they expected me to crumble quietly. Instead, I documented everything. Every letter, every threat, every procedural misstep went into a growing folder on my desk. While they gossiped in meetings, I read bylaws. While they flexed authority, I studied timelines, signatures, and clauses most residents never bothered to read. The more they pushed, the clearer it became that intimidation was their favorite shortcut. The night the police arrived, the officers were polite but cautious. They asked questions, listened carefully, and quickly realized there was no emergency. I stayed calm, answered plainly, and watched confusion replace confidence on the HOA president's face. The neighbors slowly drifted back inside, disappointed that drama had turned into silence. After the officers left, I didn't celebrate. I went home, opened my folder, and checked one date circled in red. It was the deadline for a response they had ignored. By missing it, they had triggered a clause buried deep in their own governing documents. A clause that shifted authority, ownership, and leverage in a way few people ever notice. That night, while the street returned to normal, I prepared to make a move so quiet it wouldn't be noticed until it was irreversible. The next 72 hours would decide everything. I knew the risk was enormous, because power never surrenders politely. Friends warned me to stop, to settle, to stay quiet. But silence had already cost me enough. I chose precision over noise, patience over fear, and preparation over confrontation. Somewhere in those documents was a path forward, narrow but real. If I stepped carefully, followed the rules better than those who wrote them, the system itself would do the fighting for me. By dawn, the first filing would be submitted, and nothing on that street would ever feel the same again. History was about to change quietly forever. The morning after the police left, the neighborhood looked exactly the same, but everything underneath had shifted. Cars lined the curbs, sprinklers clicked on, and the HOA president waved at people like nothing had happened. That was always their strength. They relied on appearances, on the belief that authority came from confidence rather than compliance. I brewed coffee, opened my laptop, and logged into the county records portal. This was not about revenge. It was about process. The clause I had found wasn't dramatic. It didn't scream power or threaten consequences. It was dull, technical, and buried beneath pages of procedural language. It stated that if the HOA failed to respond to a formal dispute within a specific time frame, all enforcement authority would be suspended until corrected. What followed was even more interesting. During that suspension, any unresolved liens, penalties, or enforcement actions reverted to the property holder initiating the dispute. In plain language, control didn't disappear. It transferred. They had missed the deadline by 48 hours. Most people assume HOAs are airtight, backed by lawyers and endless resources. In reality, they are often run by volunteers who grow comfortable, careless, and overconfident. They cut corners because they assume no one will challenge them seriously. I filed the confirmation notice at 9:03 a.m., attaching proof of their silence and requesting acknowledgement. Then I waited. By noon, emails started arriving. Polite at first. Curious. Then concerned. Someone asked if we could talk things through. Another suggested mediation. I replied once, attaching the same documents I had already sent and asking for written confirmation of receipt. No emotion. No threats. Just process. Behind the scenes, panic spread faster than any fine notice ever had. Emergency meetings were called. Lawyers were consulted too late. The HOA's insurance carrier requested clarification. Every step they took to regain footing only highlighted how unprepared they were. Authority, it turns out, depends heavily on timing. That evening, I walked the neighborhood. People nodded, unsure what to say after the police incident. A few whispered questions. I told them nothing concrete, only that things were being handled legally. Confusion is powerful. It forces people to pay attention. At exactly 7:18 p.m., I received the email I had been waiting for. An admission, carefully worded but unmistakable, acknowledging the missed deadline and requesting a pause. I forwarded it to the county clerk, along with a request to enact the next step outlined in the bylaws. This step allowed temporary administrative control to be reassigned while disputes were resolved. Temporary was the word they clung to. They didn't realize that temporary control included access to accounts, records, and most importantly, property authority. The second filing went through just before midnight. The clock kept ticking. 72 hours had not yet passed, but the foundation was already cracking. Power doesn't fall all at once. It leaks away, unnoticed, until one moment makes it undeniable. And that moment was getting very close. By the second morning, the tone of every message had changed. Where there had been confidence, there was now hesitation, and where there had been threats, there were apologies disguised as professionalism. I knew that meant one thing: the lawyers had finally finished reading the documents I had been studying for months. They were discovering the same uncomfortable truth I already understood. The HOA had trapped itself. At 8:11 a.m., the county clerk confirmed receipt of my filings and issued a provisional acknowledgement. It wasn't dramatic, just a short automated notice, but its implications were massive. Administrative authority was officially under review, and during that window, enforcement powers were frozen. That freeze extended further than they expected. It paused collections, halted fines, and suspended every active lien. More importantly, it transferred custodial responsibility to the initiating party. Me. I printed the notice and placed it neatly in the folder that had started this entire chain of events. Then I did something the HOA never imagined I would do. I notified the residents. Not emotionally, not publicly, and not on social media. I sent a calm, factual letter explaining that enforcement actions were temporarily suspended due to procedural review, and that no fines or penalties would be issued until further notice. I included official references and contact information for verification. The reaction was immediate. Relief spread faster than panic ever had. People who had been silent for years suddenly felt safe enough to ask questions. Stories poured in about selective enforcement, unexplained charges, and intimidation tactics eerily similar to mine. Patterns emerged. Dates aligned. Mistakes stacked up. By afternoon, the HOA board attempted to regain control. They sent a mass email claiming authority remained unchanged. Unfortunately for them, that statement directly contradicted the county acknowledgement. Within minutes, residents were forwarding messages, comparing timestamps, and noticing discrepancies. Trust evaporated. At 5:26 p.m., I received access credentials to the HOA's administrative portal, automatically generated as part of the custodial transfer. I didn't celebrate. I logged in and began documenting everything. Financial records, meeting minutes, unresolved disputes, and property actions revealed a level of negligence that went far beyond my case. This was no longer about one violation or one homeowner. The system itself was unstable, propped up by intimidation and unchecked habit. I understood then that the next step wouldn't just protect me. It would decide the fate of the entire neighborhood. As the sun set, I drafted the final notice required to escalate the review. Once submitted, ownership authority wouldn't just pause. It would legally reassign. 72 hours were almost over, and the ending they feared most was now inevitable. Nothing they tried next could stop what procedure, patience, and their own mistakes had already set into motion for everyone watching. The third day began with silence, the kind that feels heavier than shouting. No emails. No notices. No confident announcements from the HOA board. That alone told me everything. Silence meant they were scrambling, arguing, and realizing far too late that procedure does not bend for panic. I reviewed the timeline one more time, not because I doubted it, but because accuracy was now everything. At 9 a.m. sharp, I submitted the escalation notice to the county, citing continued non-compliance, contradictory communication to residents, and evidence of administrative negligence. The language was neutral, almost boring, but the effect was devastating. Under the bylaws, failure to correct or formally challenge the findings within the allotted window triggered reassignment of ownership authority tied to enforcement, liens, and communal assets. That reassignment did not mean I suddenly owned houses in the way people imagine ownership. It meant something far more powerful. Every HOA-governed home now fell under my legal authority for administration, compliance, and resolution until the matter was settled. In simple terms, the HOA no longer controlled the neighborhood. I did. The confirmation arrived just after noon. Again, no drama. Just a digital record update and a stamped acknowledgement. I sat quietly for a long moment, letting it sink in. 72 hours earlier, they had called the police to scare me. Now, their entire structure had collapsed under the weight of their own shortcuts. Word spread fast. Residents knocked on my door, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They wanted to know what would happen next. I told them the truth. Nothing drastic. No retaliation. No sudden changes. The goal was stability, transparency, and resolution. For the first time, people listened without fear. The HOA board finally broke their silence that evening. Their message was careful, legal, and late. They acknowledged the reassignment while insisting it was temporary and under review. They were right about one thing. It was under review. But reviews take time, and time was no longer on their side. I spent the night organizing records, responding to residents, and preparing the next required filings. Every step followed the rules more carefully than they ever had. That was the difference. Power used loudly invites resistance. Power used correctly reshapes outcomes quietly. As I closed my laptop near midnight, I looked out at the neighborhood. The houses were the same. The street lights glowed softly. But the fear that once ruled this place was gone. Whatever happened next, the intimidation was over. They had tried to scare me with authority they didn't fully understand. In doing so, they handed me something far more lasting than silence. They handed me control. The morning after control shifted, reality began to settle in for everyone involved. For years, the HOA had operated like an untouchable force, issuing notices, collecting fines, and making decisions behind closed doors. Now, residents were waking up to emails signed with my name instead of the board's. The tone was calm, factual, and clear, which somehow made it even more unsettling for those who had relied on fear to govern. My first priority was restraint. Power, when used carelessly, becomes indistinguishable from abuse. I issued a formal notice to all homeowners explaining exactly what had happened, what had not changed, and what protections were now in place. No fines would be enforced. No liens would be filed. No retaliatory actions would be tolerated. Every resident had the right to review records and submit concerns without penalty. Transparency replaced intimidation overnight. The response was overwhelming. My inbox filled with stories people had never dared to put in writing before. Elderly residents fined for trivial issues. Families threatened over minor landscaping choices. Selective enforcement against people who ask too many questions. Individually, each case sounded small. Together, they painted a disturbing picture of systemic misuse of authority. By midday, the HOA's attorney requested an emergency call. I agreed, with one condition: everything would be documented. The call was tense but revealing. They spoke about restoring order, minimizing disruption, and protecting the community's image. I spoke about accountability, compliance, and the consequences of ignoring procedure. When they realized intimidation no longer worked, the conversation shifted to negotiation. Meanwhile, residents began organizing. Not protests or shouting matches, but meetings focused on understanding their rights. People compared documents, timelines, and experiences. What the HOA had once kept fragmented through fear was now unified through information. That frightened them more than any confrontation ever could. In the afternoon, I reviewed the financial records more closely. Funds had been misallocated. Reserves were poorly documented. Decisions affecting millions in property value had been made without proper votes. None of it was criminal on its own, but together it explained why the board had relied so heavily on control rather than trust. As evening approached, the HOA president finally reached out directly. The message was short, careful, and uncharacteristically polite. They asked to meet. I agreed, but not on their terms. The meeting would be public, recorded, and open to residents. Authority, after all, only functions when it's visible. That night, I realized something important. The real victory wasn't legal control. It was the shift in awareness. People no longer felt alone or powerless. 72 hours had changed the balance of an entire neighborhood, not through force, but through rules followed more carefully than anyone expected. The public meeting was scheduled for the following evening, and by morning it had become the only thing anyone in the neighborhood was talking about. Chairs were set up in the community hall, cameras tested, and sign-in sheets prepared. This was no longer an internal dispute. It was a reckoning. The HOA board arrived early, stiff, and quiet, while residents filled the room with cautious curiosity. For years, meetings had been scripted performances. This one felt different. I opened the session by laying out facts, not accusations. Timelines. Missed deadlines. Contradictory notices. Financial inconsistencies. Everything was supported by documents anyone could review. There was no shouting, no theatrics. The calmness unsettled the board more than anger ever could. When authority is stripped of mystery, it loses its grip. Residents began speaking. One by one, they shared experiences that echoed each other with unsettling precision. Fines issued without explanation. Requests ignored. Appeals delayed until penalties doubled. The pattern was undeniable. What the board had dismissed as isolated complaints was revealed as routine behavior. The room shifted from tension to clarity. When the HOA president finally spoke, their voice lacked its usual confidence. They emphasized intentions, volunteer fatigue, and misunderstandings. I didn't interrupt. Intentions, however, do not override obligations. Procedure exists precisely to prevent good intentions from becoming harmful habits. The attorney attempted to regain ground by suggesting a rapid settlement, proposing reinstatement of the board in exchange for dropping the review. I declined publicly, explaining that the process now belonged to the community, not any single individual. Applause filled the room, not loud, but sustained. By the end of the meeting, something irreversible had happened. The board no longer represented authority. They represented a past structure that had lost legitimacy. Residents voted to continue the review, to audit finances, and to rewrite enforcement policies once the process concluded. What began as my dispute had become collective action. Later that night, as the hall emptied, the HOA president approached quietly. They asked why I hadn't stopped sooner, why I hadn't just complied. I answered honestly. Because compliance without fairness is surrender. And surrender teaches systems they can repeat the same behavior indefinitely. Walking home, I realized the fear that once defined this neighborhood was gone. Not replaced by chaos, but by participation. The system hadn't failed. It had worked exactly as designed when someone finally followed it all the way through. 72 hours had ended days ago, but the consequences were still unfolding. The police call meant to scare me had done the opposite. It had exposed a weakness they never knew they had. And once exposed, it could never be hidden again. In the days after the public meeting, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. People smiled more. Conversations lasted longer. Doors that had once closed quickly now stayed open. Control had not created order here. Participation had. And that realization was changing everything faster than any legal document ever could. The county review moved forward methodically. Auditors requested records. Timelines were verified. Every misstep by the HOA board was logged without emotion. I acted only as an administrator, not a ruler. Requests were processed. Questions were answered. Nothing happened in secret anymore. That transparency alone transformed how residents interacted with the system that once intimidated them. The former board attempted one last maneuver. They filed a motion claiming procedural misunderstanding and volunteer error. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, it collapsed under its own weight. Good faith errors still require correction within the rules. Authority does not excuse negligence. When the response deadline passed without proper amendment, the motion expired quietly, just like their power had. One afternoon, I received a message from a resident who had lived there longer than anyone else. They thanked me, not for taking control, but for proving something important. That the rules were not weapons reserved for those in charge. They were protections meant for everyone, if someone was willing to read them carefully enough. That message stayed with me. Because this had never been about winning. It had been about refusing to accept fear as normal. Systems that rely on intimidation depend on silence to survive. The moment silence breaks, the system has to answer for itself. By the end of the week, the county issued its preliminary conclusion. The HOA's Enforcement Authority would remain reassigned until a new, compliance structure was formed. Residents would vote. Policies would be rewritten. Financial oversight would be mandatory. What had once felt untouchable was now just another organization required to follow the same rules as everyone else. Standing on my porch that evening, I watched kids ride bikes down the street, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Parents talked openly. Laughter carried farther. The neighborhood was healing in ways no fine or warning ever could. I thought back to the police cars, the crossed arms, the certainty that fear would end this quietly. Instead, it had started something larger. The attempt to intimidate me had revealed how fragile their authority really was. The story, however, wasn't finished yet. There was still one final decision ahead, one outcome that would define what all of this truly meant. And when that decision came, it would close the circle they never should have opened. The final decision arrived on a quiet afternoon, delivered not with ceremony but with a formal notice stamped and logged like any other piece of routine correspondence. That was fitting. This entire journey had been defined by ordinary rules producing extraordinary consequences. The county's conclusion was clear, precise, and impossible to spin. The HOA's previous structure was officially dissolved due to sustained non-compliance, and a transitional ownership and governance framework was enacted. What that meant in plain terms was this: until a new, fully compliant association was formed and approved. All HOA-controlled properties remained under my legal administrative ownership. Not symbolic influence. Not temporary supervision. Actual, documented authority over every HOA-governed home. The reaction was mixed but measured. Some residents felt disbelief, others relief. A few worried about uncertainty, which was understandable. I addressed that immediately. Ownership, I explained, did not mean possession. No one's home was being taken. No one's life was being disrupted. This was about stewardship, not dominance. About ensuring no one could be intimidated the way so many had been before. We moved quickly but carefully. A temporary resident council was formed. Clear rules were drafted with public input. Every clause was explained in plain language. Nothing was hidden behind legal jargon anymore. For the first time, governance felt collaborative instead of threatening. The former board members faded quietly into the background. There were no apologies, no dramatic exits. Just the slow realization that authority without accountability cannot survive scrutiny. Their greatest mistake hadn't been calling the police. It had been assuming fear would protect them from consequences. One evening, a neighbor asked me if I felt victorious. The question caught me off guard. Victory implies an enemy. What I felt instead was calm. A sense of closure. The system had worked because someone insisted on following it fully, not selectively. That distinction mattered. As weeks passed, the neighborhood stabilized. Property values stopped fluctuating. Complaints dropped. People started trusting the process again because the process finally served them. The power that once hovered over everyone like a thread had been grounded, defined, and shared. Late one night, I walked the same street where police cars had once parked. The memory felt distant now, almost unreal. What began as an attempt to scare me had ended in something far larger than anyone anticipated. There was one last thing left to do. One final message to deliver. Not just to the HOA, but to anyone watching who believed intimidation was unbeatable. That message would close the story, not with anger, but with clarity. And it would explain why 72 hours had been all it took to change everything. The final message wasn't sent through lawyers, filings, or official notices. It was delivered quietly, through example. People often ask how 72 hours could overturn something that had stood for years. The answer is simple, but uncomfortable. Systems built on intimidation are usually fragile. They appear powerful only because no one tests them all the way to the end. I never set out to control an entire HOA. I set out to protect myself. Everything that followed happened because the rules were followed more carefully by the person they were meant to silence. That is the part rarely discussed. Authority does not come from titles, loud voices, or even police calls. It comes from compliance with the same procedures imposed on everyone else. The HOA believed fear would end the problem. They believed escalation would force submission. Instead, escalation exposed their shortcuts, their missed deadlines, and their reliance on people not knowing their rights. The moment those rights were exercised fully, the illusion of control vanished. In the months that followed, a new association was eventually formed. This time, bylaws were written with resident input. Enforcement policies included clear appeals, strict timelines, and independent oversight. Meetings were recorded. Records were accessible. Power was distributed, not concentrated. The neighborhood didn't become perfect, but it became fair. And fairness changes everything. Sometimes I'm asked whether I would do it again. The honest answer is yes, but not because of the outcome. I would do it again because silence teaches systems that intimidation works. Speaking up, carefully and correctly, teaches them that it doesn't. The police officers who came that evening never knew the role they played. They were polite, professional, and simply doing their jobs. But the call itself revealed desperation. When an organization reaches for intimidation instead of procedure, it signals weakness. That weakness is what ultimately undid them. If there is one lesson in all of this, it's not about HOAs specifically. It's about power. Any system that depends on fear depends on people not reading, not questioning, and not documenting. The moment someone does all three, the balance shifts. 72 hours didn't give me confidence. Preparation did. Patience did. The willingness to stay calm while others tried to provoke a reaction did. That is what turned a threat into an opportunity and intimidation into accountability. Today, the street looks ordinary again. Cars parked. Lights on. People living their lives. But something fundamental has changed. Everyone knows now that authority must answer to the rules it enforces. And once people learn that, they never forget it. They called the police to scare me. Instead, they taught an entire neighborhood how fragile unchecked power really is. And that lesson will last far longer than any HOA ever could.